The vengeance of the dead. It is a bad thing for a man to die with an unsatisfied thirst for revenge parching his soul. David Allen died cursing Bernard Heaton and Lawyer Gray, hating the lawyer who had won the case even more than the man who was to gain by the winning. Yet, if cursing were to be done, David should rather have cursed his own stubbornness and stupidity. To go back for some years, this is what had happened. Squire Heaton's only son went wrong. The squire raged, as was natural. He was one of a long line of hard-drinking, hard-riding, hard-swearing squires, and it was maddening to think that his only son should deliberately take to books and cold water when there was manly sport on the countryside and old wine in the cellar. Yet before now, such blows have descended upon deserving men, and they have to be borne as best they may. Squire Heaton bore it badly, and when his son went off on a government scientific expedition around the world, the squire drank harder and swore harder than ever, but never mentioned the boy's name. 2 years after, young Heaton returned, but the doors of the hall were closed against him. He had no mother to plead for him, although it was not likely that would have made any difference, for the squire was not a man to be appealed to and swayed this way or that. He took his hedges, his drinks, and his course in life straight. The young man went to India, where he was drowned. As there is no mystery in this matter, it may as well be stated here that young Heaton ultimately returned to England, as drowned men have ever been in the habit of doing when their return will mightily inconvenience innocent persons who have taken their places. It is a disputed question whether the sudden disappearance of a man or his reappearance after a lapse of years is the more annoying. If the old squire felt remorse at the supposed death of his only son, he did not show it. The hatred which had been directed against his unnatural offspring redoubled itself and was bestowed on his nephew, David Allen, who was now the legal heir to the estate and its income. Allen was the impecunious son of the squire's sister, who had married badly. It is hard to starve when one is heir to a fine property, but that is what David did, and it soured him. The Jews would not lend on the security. The son might return. So David Allen waited for a dead man's shoes, impoverished and embittered. At last, the shoes were ready for him to step into. The old squire died as a gentleman should, of apoplexy, in his armchair with the decanter at his elbow. David Allen entered into his belated inheritance, and his first act was to discharge every servant, male and female, about the place, and engage others who owed their situations to him alone. Then were the Jews sorry they had not trusted him. He was now rich, but broken in health, with bent shoulders, without a friend on the earth. He was a man suspicious of all the world, and he had a furtive look over his shoulder, as if he expected fate to deal him a sudden blow, as indeed it did. It was a beautiful June day, when there passed the porter's lodge and walked up the avenue to the main entrance of the hall, a man whose face was bronzed by a torrid sun. He requested speech with the master, and was asked into a room to wait. At length David Allen shuffled in, with his bent shoulders, glaring at the intruder from under his bushy eyebrows. The stranger rose as he entered and extended his hand. "You don't know me, of course. I believe we have never met before. I am your cousin." Allen ignored the outstretched hand. "I have no cousin," he said. "I am Bernard Heaton, the son of your uncle." "Bernard Heaton is dead." I beg your pardon, he is not. I ought to know, for I tell you I am he. You lie. Heaton, who had been standing since his cousin's entrance, now sat down again, Allen remaining on his feet. Look here, said the newcomer. Civility costs nothing, and I cannot be civil to an impostor. Quite so. It is difficult. Still, if I am an impostor, civility can do no harm, while if it should turn out that I am not an impostor, then your present tone may make after arrangements all the harder upon you. Now, will you oblige me by sitting down? I dislike, while sitting myself, talking to a standing man. Will you oblige me by stating what you want before I order my servants to turn you out? I see you are going to be hard on yourself. I will endeavor to keep my temper, and if I succeed, it will be a triumph for a member of our family. I am to state what I want? I will. I want as my own the 3 rooms on the first floor of the south wing, the rooms communicating with each other. You perceive I at least know the house. I want my meals served there, and I wish to be undisturbed at all hours. Next, I desire that you settle upon me, say, 500 a year or 600 out of the revenues of the estate. I am engaged in scientific research of a peculiar kind. I can make money, of course, but I wish my mind left entirely free from financial worry. I shall not interfere with your enjoyment of the estate in the least. I'll wager you will not. So, you think I am fool enough to harbor and feed the first idle vagabond that comes along and claims to be my dead cousin? Go to the courts with your story and be imprisoned, as similar perjurers have been. Of course, I don't expect you to take my word for it. If you were any judge of human nature, you would see I am not a vagabond. Still, that's neither here nor there. Choose 3 of your own friends. I will lay my proofs before them and abide by their decision. Come, nothing could be fairer than that, now could it? Go to the courts, I tell you. Oh, certainly, but only as a last resort. No wise man goes to law if there is another course open. But what is the use of taking such an absurd position? You know I'm your cousin. I'll take you blindfold into every room in the place. Any discharged servant could do that. I have had enough of you. I am not a man to be blackmailed. Will you leave the house yourself, or shall I call the servants to put you out? I should be sorry to trouble you, said Heaton, rising. That is your last word, I take it? Absolutely. Then, goodbye. We shall meet at Philippi. Allen watched him disappear down the avenue, and it dimly occurred to him that he had not acted diplomatically. Heaton went directly to Lawyer Gray and laid the case before him. He told the lawyer what his modest demands were, and gave instructions that if, at any time before the suit came off, his cousin would compromise, an arrangement avoiding publicity should be arrived at. Excuse me for saying, that looks like weakness, remarked the lawyer. I know it does, answered Heaton, but my case is so strong that I can afford to have it appear weak. The lawyer shook his head. He knew how uncertain the law was, but he soon discovered that no compromise was possible. The case came to trial, and the verdict was entirely in favor of Bernard Heaton. The pallor of death spread over the sallow face of David Allen as he realized that he was once again a man without a penny or a foot of land. he left the court with bowed head, speaking no words to those who had defended him. Heaton hurried after him, overtaking him on the pavement. "I knew this had to be the result," he said to the defeated man. "No other outcome was possible. I have no desire to cast you penniless into the street. What you refuse to me, I shall be glad to offer you. I will make the annuity £1,000. Allen, trembling, darted one look of malignant hate at his cousin. "You successful scoundrel!" he cried. "You and your villainous confederate Gray. I tell you—" The blood rushed to his mouth. He fell upon the pavement and died. One and the same day had robbed him of his land and his life. Bernard Heaton deeply regretted the tragic issue, but went on with his researches at the Hall, keeping much to himself. Lawyer Gray, who had won renown by his conduct of the celebrated case, was almost his only friend. To him, Heaton partially disclosed his hopes, told what he had learned during those years he had been lost to the world in India, and claimed that if he succeeded in combining the occultism of the East with the science of the West, he would make for himself a name of imperishable renown. The lawyer, a practical man of the world, tried to persuade Heaton to abandon his particular line of research, but without success. "No good can come of it," said Gray. "India has spoiled you. Men who dabble too much in that sort of thing go mad. The brain is a delicate instrument. Do not trifle with it." "Nevertheless," persisted Heaton, "the great discoveries of the 20th century are going to be in that line, just as the great discoveries of the 19th century have been in the direction of electricity. The cases are not parallel. Electricity is a tangible substance." "Is it? Then tell me what it is composed of. We all know how it is generated, and we know partly what it will do, but what is it?" "I shall have to charge you 6 and 8 pence for answering that question," the lawyer had said with a laugh. "At any rate, there is a good deal to be discovered about electricity yet. Turn your attention to that and leave this Indian nonsense alone." Yet, astonishing as it may seem, Bernard Heaton, to his undoing, succeeded, after many futile attempts, several times narrowly escaping death. Inventors and discoverers have to risk their lives as often as soldiers, with less chance of worldly glory. First, his invisible excursions were confined to the house and his own grounds. Then he went further afield, and to his intense astonishment, one day he met the spirit of the man who hated him. "Ah," said David Allen, "you did not live long to enjoy your ill-gotten gains." "You are as wrong in this sphere of existence as you were in the other. I am not dead." "Then why are you here and in this shape?" "I suppose there is no harm in telling you. What I wanted to discover, at the time you would not give me a hearing, was how to separate the spirit from its servant, the body, that is, temporarily and not finally. My body is, at this moment, lying apparently asleep in a locked room in my house, one of the rooms I begged from you. In an hour or two I shall return and take possession of it." "And how do you take possession of it and quit it?" Heaton, pleased to notice the absence of that rancor which had formerly been Allen's most prominent characteristic, and feeling that any information given to a disembodied spirit was safe as far as the world was concerned, launched out on the subject that possessed his whole mind. "It is very interesting," said Allen when he had finished. And so they parted. David Allen at once proceeded to the Hall, which he had not seen since the day he left it to attend the trial. He passed quickly through the familiar apartments until he entered the locked room on the first floor of the south wing. There on the bed lay the body of Heaton, most of the color gone from the face, but breathing regularly, if almost imperceptibly, like a mechanical wax figure. If a watcher had been in the room, he would have seen the color slowly return to the face and the sleeper gradually awaken, at last rising from the bed. Allen, in the body of Heaton, at first felt very uncomfortable, as a man does who puts on an ill-fitting suit of clothes. The limitations caused by the wearing of a body also discommoded him. He looked carefully around the room. It was plainly furnished. A desk in the corner he found contained the manuscript of a book prepared for the printer, all executed with the neat accuracy of a scientific man. Above the desk, pasted against the wall, was a sheet of paper headed, "What to do if I am found here apparently dead." Underneath were plainly written instructions. It was evident that Heaton had taken no one into his confidence. It is well if you go in for revenge to make it as complete as possible. Allen gathered up the manuscript, placed it in the grate, and set a match to it. Thus he at once destroyed his enemy's chances of posthumous renown, and also removed evidence that might, in certain contingencies, prove Heaton's insanity. Unlocking the door, he proceeded down the stairs, where he met a servant who told him luncheon was ready. He noticed that the servant was one whom he had discharged, so he came to the conclusion that Heaton had taken back all the old retainers who had applied to him when the result of the trial became public. Before lunch was over, he saw that some of his own servants were also there still. "Send the gamekeeper to me," said Allen to the servant. Brown came in, who had been on the estate for 20 years continuously, with the exception of the few months after Allen had packed him off. "What pistols have I, Brown?" "Well, sir, there's the old squire's dueling pistols, rather out of date, sir. Then your own pair, and that American revolver." "Is the revolver in working order?" "Oh, yes, sir." "Then bring it to me, and some cartridges." When Brown returned with the revolver, his master took it and examined it. "Be careful, sir," said Brown anxiously. "You know it's a self-cocker, sir." "A what?" "A self-cocking revolver, sir," trying to repress his astonishment at the question his master asked about a weapon with which he should have been familiar. "Show me what you mean," said Allen, handing back the revolver. Brown explained that the mere pulling of the trigger fired the weapon. "Now shoot at the end window, never mind the glass. Don't stand gaping at me, do as I tell you." Brown fired the revolver, and a diamond pane snapped out of the window. "How many times will that shoot without reloading?" "7 times, sir." "Very good. Put in a cartridge for the one you fired, and leave the revolver with me. Find out when there is a train to town and let me know." It will be remembered that the dining room incident was used at the trial, but without effect, as going to show that Bernard Heaton was insane. Brown also testified that there was something queer about his master that day. David Allen found all the money he needed in the pockets of Bernard Heaton. He caught his train and took a cab from the station directly to the law offices of Messrs. Gray, Leeson, and Gray, anxious to catch the lawyer before he left for the day. The clerk sent up word that Mr. Heaton wished to see the senior Mr. Gray for a few moments. Allen was asked to walk up. "You know the way, sir," said the clerk. Allen hesitated. "Announce me, if you please." The clerk, being well trained, showed no surprise, but led the visitor to Mr. Gray's door. "How are you, Heaton?" said the lawyer cordially. "Take a chair. Where have you been keeping yourself this long time? How are the Indian experiments coming on?" "Admirably, admirably," answered Allen. At the sound of his voice, the lawyer looked up quickly, then, apparently reassured, he said, "You're not looking quite the same. Been keeping yourself too much indoors, I imagine. You ought to quit research and do some shooting this autumn." "I intend to, and I hope then to have your company." "I shall be pleased to run down, although I am no great hand at a gun." "I want to speak with you a few moments in private. Would you mind locking the door so that we may not be interrupted?" "We are quite safe from interruption here," said the lawyer, as he turned the key in the lock. Then, resuming his seat, he added, "Nothing serious, I hope?" "It is rather serious. Do you mind my sitting here?" asked Allen, as he drew up his chair so that he was between Gray and the door, with the table separating them. The lawyer was watching him with anxious face, but without, as yet, serious apprehension. "Now," said Allen, "will you answer me a simple question? To whom are you talking?" "To whom?" The lawyer, in his amazement, could get no further. "Yes, to whom are you talking? Name him." "Heaton, what is the matter with you? Are you ill?" "Well, you have mentioned a name, but being a villain and a lawyer, you cannot give a direct answer to a very simple question. You think you are talking to that poor fool Bernard Heaton. It is true that the body you are staring at is Heaton's body, but the man you are talking to is David Allen, the man you swindled and then murdered. Sit down. If you move, you are a dead man. Don't try to edge to the door. There are 7 deaths in this revolver, and the whole 7 can be let loose in less than that many seconds, for this is a self-cocking instrument. Now, it will take you at least 10 seconds to get to the door, so remain exactly where you are. That advice will strike you as wise, even if, as you think, you have to do with a madman. You asked me a minute ago how the Indian experiments were coming on, and I answered admirably. Bernard Heaton left his body this morning, and I, David Allen, am now in possession of it. Do you understand? I admit it is a little difficult for the legal mind to grasp such a situation." "Ah, not at all," said Gray airily. "I comprehend it perfectly. The man I see before me is the spirit, life, soul, whatever you like to call it, of David Allen in the body of my friend Bernard Heaton. The essence of my friend is at this moment fruitlessly searching for his missing body. Perhaps he is in this room now, not knowing how to get out a spiritual writ of ejectment against you." "You show more quickness than I expected of you," said Allen. "Thanks," rejoined Gray, although he said to himself, "Heaton has gone mad. Stark, staring mad, as I expected he would. He is armed. The situation is becoming dangerous. I must humor him." "Thanks. And now may I ask you what you propose to do? You have not come here for legal advice. You never, unluckily for me, were a client of mine." "No. I did not come either to give or take advice. I am here alone with you. You gave orders that we were not to be disturbed, remember, for the sole purpose of revenging myself on you and on Heaton. Now listen, for the scheme will commend itself to your ingenious mind. I shall murder you in this room. I shall then give myself up. I shall vacate this body in Newgate Prison, and your friend may then resume his tenancy or not as he chooses. He may allow the unoccupied body to die in the cell, or he may take possession of it and be hanged for murder. Do you appreciate the completeness of my vengeance on you both? Do you think your friend will care to put on his body again? It is a nice question, said the lawyer, as he edged his chair imperceptibly along and tried to grope behind himself, unperceived by his visitor, for the electric button placed against the wall. It is a nice question, and I would like to have time to consider it in all its bearings before I gave an answer. You shall have all the time you care to allow yourself. I am in no hurry, and I wish you to realize your situation as completely as possible. Allow me to say that the electric button is a little to the left and slightly above where you are feeling for it. I merely mention this because I must add, in fairness to you, that the moment you touch it, time ends as far as you are concerned. When you press the ivory button, I fire. The lawyer rested his arms on the table before him, and for the first time, a hunted look of alarm came into his eyes, which died out of them when, after a moment or two of intense fear, he regained possession of himself. I would like to ask you a question or two, he said at last. As many as you choose. I am in no hurry, as I said before. I am thankful for your reiteration of that. The first question is, then, has a temporary residence in another sphere interfered in any way with your reasoning powers? I think not. I had hoped that your appreciation of logic might have improved during your, well, let us say, absence. You were not very logical, not very amenable to reason formally. I know you thought so. I did. So did your own legal advisor, by the way. Well, now let me ask you why you are so bitter against me. Why not murder the judge who charged against you, or the jury that unanimously gave a verdict in our favor? I was merely an instrument, as were they. It was your devilish trickiness that won the case. That statement is flattering, but untrue. The case was its own best advocate. But you haven't answered the question. Why not murder judge and jury? I would gladly do so if I had them in my power. You see, I am perfectly logical. Quite, said the lawyer. I am encouraged to proceed. Now, of what did my devilish trickiness rob you? Of my property, and then of my life. I deny both allegations, but will, for the sake of the argument, admit them for the moment. First, as to your property. It was a possession that might at any moment be jeopardized by the return of Bernard Heaton. By the real Bernard Heaton, yes. Very well, then. As you are now repossessed of the property, and as you have the outward semblance of Heaton, your rights cannot be questioned. As far as property is concerned, you are now in an unassailable position where formerly you were in an assailable one. Do you follow me? Perfectly. We come second to the question of life. You then occupied a body frail, bent, and diseased. A body which, as events showed, gave way under exceptional excitement. You are now in a body strong and healthy, with apparently a long life before it. You admit the truth of all I have said on these 2 points? I quite admit it. Then, to sum up, you are now in a better position, infinitely, both as regards life and property, than the one from which my malignity, ingenuity, I think was your word, yes, trickiness, thanks, removed you. Now, why cut your career short? Why murder me? Why not live out your life under better conditions, in luxury and health, and thus be completely revenged on Bernard Heaton? If you are logical, now is the time to show it. Alan rose slowly, holding the pistol in his right hand. "You miserable scoundrel," he cried. "You pettifogging lawyer! Tricky to the last. How gladly you would throw over your friend to prolong your own wretched existence. Do you think you are now talking to a biased judge and a susceptible, brainless jury? Revenged on Heaton? I am revenged on him already. But part of my vengeance involves your death. Are you ready for it?" Alan pointed the revolver at Gray, who had now also risen, his face ashen. He kept his eyes fastened on the man he believed to be mad. His hand crept along the wall. There was intense silence between them. Alan did not fire. Slowly, the lawyer's hand moved towards the electric button. At last, he felt the ebony rim, and his fingers quickly covered it. In the stillness, the vibrating ring of an electric bell somewhere below was audible. Then the sharp crack of the revolver suddenly split the silence. The lawyer dropped on one knee, holding his arm in the air as if to ward off attack. Again the revolver rang out, and Gray plunged forward on his face. The other 5 shots struck a lifeless body. A stratum of blue smoke hung breast high in the room, as if it were the departing soul of the man who lay motionless on the floor. Outside were excited voices, and someone flung himself ineffectually against the stout locked door. Alan crossed the room and, turning the key, flung open the door. "I have murdered your master," he said, handing the revolver butt forward to the nearest man. "I give myself up. Go and get an officer." Over the Stelvio Pass. There is no question about it. Tina Lenz was a flirt, as she had a perfect right to be, living as she did on the romantic shores of Como, celebrated in song, story, and drama as the lover's blue lake. Tina had many admirers, and it was just like her perversity to favor the one to whom her father most objected. Pietro, as the father truly said, was a beggarly Italian driver, glad of the few francs he got from the travelers he took over the humble Maloga to the Engadin, or over the elevated Stelvio to the Tyrol, the lowest and the highest passes in Europe. It was a sad blow to the hopes as well as the family pride of old Lenz when Tina defiantly announced her preferences for the driver of the Zweispanner. Old Lenz came of a long and distinguished line of Swiss hotel keepers, noted for the success with which they squeezed the last attainable centime from the reluctant traveler. It was bad enough that he had no son to inherit his justly celebrated hotel, pension rates for a stay of not less than 80 days, but he hoped for a son-in-law, preferably of Swiss extraction, to whom he might, in his old age, hand over the lucrative profession of deferentially skinning the wealthy Englishman. And now Tina had deliberately chosen a reckless, unstable Italian who would, in a short time, scatter to the winds the careful accumulation of years. "Pietro, the scoundrel, will not have 1 piastra of my money," cried the old man wrathfully, dropping into Italian as he was speaking about a native of Italy. "No, I shall see that he doesn't," said the girl. "I shall hold the purse, and he must earn what he spends." "But if you marry him, you will not have any of it." "Oh, yes, I shall, Papa," said Tina confidently. "You have no one else to leave it to. Besides, you are not old, and you will be reconciled to our marriage long before there is any question of leaving money." "Don't be so sure of that," returned the hotel keeper, much mollified, because he was old and corpulent and red in the face. He felt that he was no match for his daughter, and that she would likely have her own way in the long run, but he groaned when he thought of Pietro as proprietor of the prosperous pension. Tina insisted that she would manage the hotel on the strictest principles of her ancestors, and that she would keep Pietro lounging about the place as a picturesque ornament to attract sentimental visitors who seemed to see some unaccountable beauty about the lake and its surroundings. Meanwhile, landlord Lenz promptly discharged Pietro and cursed the day and hour he had first engaged him. He informed the picturesque young man that if he caught him talking to his daughter, he would promptly have him arrested for some little thefts from travelers of which he had been guilty, although the landlord had condoned them at the time of discovery, probably because he had a fellow feeling in the matter and saw the making of a successful hotel proprietor in the Zweispänner driver. Pietro, on his part, to make things pleasant all around, swore that on the first favorable opportunity he would run 6 inches of knife into the extensive corporation of the landlord, hoping in that length of steel to reach a vital spot. The ruddy face of old Lenz paled at this threat, for the Swiss are a peace-loving people, and he told his daughter sadly that she was going to bring her father's gray hairs in sorrow to the grave through the medium of her lover's stiletto. This feat, however, would have been difficult to perform, as the girl flippantly pointed out to him, for the old man was as bald as the smooth round top of the Adler. Nevertheless, she spoke to her lover about it, and told him frankly that if there was any knife practice in that vicinity, he need never come to see her again. So the young man with the curly black hair and the face of an angel swallowed his resentment against his desired father-in-law and promised to behave himself. He secured a position as driver at another hotel, for the season was brisk, and he met Tina when he could at the bottom of the garden overlooking the placid lake, he on one side of the stone wall, she on the other. If landlord Lenz knew of these meetings, he did not interfere. Perhaps he was frightened of Pietro's stiletto, or perhaps he feared his daughter's tongue. Nevertheless, the stars in their courses were fighting for the old man. Tina was naturally of a changeable disposition, and now that all opposition had vanished, she began to lose interest in Pietro. He could talk of little else than horses, and interesting as such conversation undoubtedly is, it palls upon a girl of 18 leaning over a stone wall in the golden evening light that hovers above Como. There are other subjects, but that is neither here nor there, as Pietro did not recognize the fact, and unfortunately for him, there happened to come along a member of the great army of the unemployed who did. He came that way just in the nick of time, and proud as old Lenz was of his pension and its situation, it was not the unrivaled prospect, as stated in the hotel advertisements, that stopped him. It was the sight of a most lovely girl leaning over the stone wall at the foot of the garden, gazing down at the lake and singing softly to herself. "By Jove," said young Standish, "she looks as if she were waiting for her lover." Which, indeed, was exactly what Tina was doing, and it augured ill for the missing man that she was not the least impatient at his delay. "The missing lover is a defect in the landscape which ought to be supplied," murmured young Standish as he unslung his knapsack, which, like that of the late John Brown, was strapped upon his back. He entered the pension and inquired the rates. Old Lenz took one glance at the knickerbockers, and at once asked twice as much as would have charged a native. Standish agreed to the terms, with that financial recklessness characteristic of his island, and the old man regretted he had not asked a third more. "But never mind," he said to himself as the newly arrived guest disappeared to his room. "I shall make it up on the extras." With deep regret, it must be here admitted that young Standish was an artist. Artists are met with so often in fiction that it is a matter of genuine grief to have to deal with one in a narrative of fact. But it must be remembered that artists flock as naturally to the Lake of Como as stockbrokers to the exchange, and in setting down an actual statement of occurrences in that locality, the unfortunate writer finds himself confronted with artists at every turn. Standish was an artist in watercolors, but whether that is a mitigation or an aggravation of the original offense, the relator knoweth not. He speedily took to painting Tina amidst various combinations of lake and mountain scenery. Tina over the garden wall as he first saw her, Tina under an arch of roses, Tina in one of the clumsy but picturesque lake boats. He did his work very well, too. Old landlord Lenz had the utmost contempt for this occupation, as a practical man should, but he was astonished one day when a passing traveler offered an incredible sum for one of the pictures that stood on the hall table. Standish was not to be found, but the old man, quite willing to do his guest a good turn, sold the picture. The young man, instead of being overjoyed at his luck, told the landlord, with the calm check of an artist, that he would overlook the matter this time, but it must not occur again. He had sold the picture, added Standish, for about 1/3 its real value. There was something in the quiet assurance of the youth that more than his words convinced old Lenz of the truth of his statement. Manner has much to do with getting a well-told lie believed. The innkeeper's respect for the young man went up to the highest attainable point, and he had seen so many artists, too. But if such prices were obtained for a picture dashed off in a few hours, the hotel business wasn't in it as a money-making venture. It must be confessed that it was a great shock to young Standish when he found that the fairy-like Tina was the daughter of the gross old stupid keeper of the inn. It would have been so nice if she had happened to be a princess, and the fact would have worked in well with the marble terrace overlooking the lake. It seemed out of keeping entirely that she should be any relation to the old money-making Lenz. Of course, he had no more idea of marrying the girl than he had of buying the Lake of Como and draining it. Still, it was such a pity that she was not a countess at least. There were so many of them in Italy, too. Surely one might have been spared for that pension when a man had to stay 8 days to get the lowest rates. Nevertheless, Tina did make a pretty watercolor sketch. But a man who begins sliding down a hill, such as there is around Como, never can tell exactly where he is going to bring up. He may stop halfway, or he may go headfirst into the lake. If it were to be set down here that within a certain space of time Standish did not care one confidential obligation whether Tina was a princess or a charwoman. The statement would simply not be believed, because we all know that Englishmen are a cold, calculating race of men with long side whiskers and a veil around their hats when they travel. It is serious when a young fellow sketches in watercolors a charming sylph-like girl in various entrancing attitudes. It is disastrous when she teaches him a soft flowing language like the Italian, but it is absolute destruction when he teaches her the English tongue and watches her pretty lips strive to surround words never intended for the vocal resources of a foreigner. As all these influences were brought to bear on Walter Standish, what chance did the young fellow have? Absolutely as little as has the unroped man who misses his footing on the Matterhorn. And Tina? Poor little girl, she was getting paid back with a vengeance for all the heartaches she had caused, Italian, German, or Swiss variety. She fell helplessly in love with the stalwart Englishman, and realized that she had never known before what the word meant. Bitterly did she regret the sham battles of the heart that she had hitherto engaged in. Standish took it so entirely for granted that he was the first to touch her lips. In fact, she admitted as much herself, that she was in daily, hourly terror lest he should learn the truth. Meanwhile, Pietro unburdened his neglected soul of strange, oily imprecations that might have sounded to the uneducated ear of Standish like mellifluous benedictions, notwithstanding the progress he was making in Italian under Tina's tuition. However, Pietro had one panacea for all his woes, and that he proceeded to sharpen carefully. One evening, Standish was floating dreamily through the purple haze, thinking about Tina, of course, and wondering how her piquant archness and southern beauty would strike his sober people at home. Tina was very quick and adaptable, and he had no doubt she could act to perfection any part he assigned to her, so he was in doubt whether to introduce her as a remote connection of the reigning family of Italy, or merely as a countess in her own right. It would be quite easy to immobile the long line of hotel keepers by the action of D or de or some such syllable to the family name. He must look up the right combination of letters. He knew it began with D. Then the pension could become dimly a castle on the Italian lakes, you know. In fact, he would close up the program as soon as he had the power, or change it to a palace. He knew that most of the castles in the Tyrol and many of the places of Italy had become boarding houses, so why not reverse the process? He was sure that certain furnishing houses in London could do it, probably on the hire system. He knew a fashionable morning paper that was in the habit of publishing personal items at so much a line, and he thought the following would read well and be worth its cost. Mr. Walter Standish of St. John's Wood and his wife, the Contessa di Lenza, are spending the summer in the lady's ancestral home, the Palazzo di Lenza, on the Lake of Como. This bright vision pleased him for a moment, until he thought it would be just his luck for some acquaintance to happen along who remembered the Palazzo Lenza when it was the pension lens. Rates on application. He wished a landslide would carry buildings, grounds, and everything else away to some unrecognizable spot a few hundred feet down the mountain. Thus it was that young Standish floated along with his head in the clouds, swinging his cane in the air, when suddenly he was brought sharply down to earth again. A figure darted out from behind a tree. An instinct rather than reason caused the artist to guard himself by throwing up his left arm. He caught the knife thrust in the fleshy part of it, and the pain was like the red-hot sting of a gigantic wasp. It flashed through his brain then that the term cold steel was a misnomer. The next moment his right hand had brought down the heavy knob of his stout stick on the curly head of the Italian, and Pietro fell like a log at his feet. Standish set his teeth, and as gently as possible drew the stiletto from his arm, wiping its blade on the clothes of the prostrate man. He thought it better to soil Pietro's suit than his own, which was newer and cleaner. Besides, he held, perhaps with justice, that the Italian, being the aggressor, should bear any disadvantages arising from the attack. Finally, feeling wet at the elbow, he put the stiletto in his pocket and hurried off to the hotel. Tina fell back against the wall with a cry at the sight of the blood. She would have fainted, but something told her that she would be well advised to keep her senses about her at that moment. "I can't imagine why he should attack me," said Standish as he bared his arm to be bandaged. "I never saw him before, and I have had no quarrel with anyone. It could not have been robbery, for I was too near the hotel. I cannot understand it." "Oh," began old Lenz, "it's easy enough to account for it. Tina darted one look at her father that went through him as the blade had gone through the outstretched arm. His mouth closed like a steel trap. "Please go for Dr. Zandorf, Papa," she said sweetly, and the old man went. "These Italians," she continued to Standish, "are always quarreling. The villain mistook you for someone else in the dusk." "Ah, that's it, very likely. If the rascal has returned to his senses, he probably regrets having waked up the wrong passenger." When the authorities searched for Pietro, they found that he had disappeared as absolutely as though Standish had knocked him through into China. When he came to himself and rubbed his head, he saw the blood on the road, and he knew his stroke had gone home somewhere. The missing knife would be evidence against him, so he thought it safer to get on the Austrian side of the fence. Thus he vanished over the Stelvio Pass and found horses to drive on the other side. The period during which Standish loafed around that lovely garden with his arm in a sling, waited upon assiduously and tenderly by Tina, will always be one of the golden remembrances of the Englishman's life. It was too good to last forever, and so they were married when it came to an end. The old man would still have preferred a Swiss innkeeper for a son-in-law, yet the Englishman was better than the beggarly Italian, and possibly better than the German, who had occupied a place in Tina's regards before the son of sunny Italy appeared on the scene. That is one trouble in the continental hotel business. There is such a bewildering mixture of nationalities. Standish thought it best not to go back to England at once, as he had not quite settled to his own satisfaction how the pension was to be eliminated from the affair and transformed into a palace. He knew a lovely and elevated castle in the Tyrol near Meeren, where they accepted passers-by in an unobtrusive sort of way, and there, he resolved, they would make their plans. So the old man gave them a great set-out with which to go over the pass, privately charging the driver to endeavor to get a return fare from Meran, so as to, partly at least, cover the outlay. The carriage was drawn by 5 horses, 1 on each side of the pole and 3 in front. They rested the first night at Bormeo and started early next day for over the pass, expecting to dine at Fudenshöhe within sight of the snowy Orla. It was late in the season, and the weather was slightly uncertain, but they had a lovely Italian forenoon for going up the wonderful zigzag road on the western side of the pass. At the top there was a slight sprinkling of snow, and clouds hung over the lofty Ortler group of peaks. As they got lower down, a steady, persistent rain set in, and they were glad to get to the shelter and warmth of the oblong stone inn at Franzenhohe, where a good dinner awaited them. After dinner, the weather cleared somewhat, but the clouds still obscured the tops of the mountains, and the roads were slippery. Standish regretted this, for he wanted to show his bride the splendid scenery of the next 5 miles, where the road zigzags down to Trefo, each elbow of the dizzy thoroughfare overhanging the most awful precipices. It was a dangerous bit of road, and even with only 2 horses, requires a cool and courageous driver with a steady head. They were the sole guests at the inn, and it needed no practiced eye to see that they were a newly married couple. The news spread abroad, and every lounger about the place watched them get into their carriage and drive away, one hind wheel of the carriage sliding on its skid, and all brakes on. At the first turning, Standish started, for the carriage went around it with dangerous speed. The whip cracked, too, like a succession of pistol shots, which was unusual going down the mountain. He said nothing to alarm his bride, but thought that the driver had taken on more wine than was good for him at the inn. At the second turn, the wheel actually slid against and bumped the stone post that was the sole guard from the fearful precipice below. The sound and shock sent a cold chill up the back of Standish, for he knew the road well, and there were worse places to come. His arm was around his wife, and he withdrew it gently so as not to alarm her. As he did so, she looked up and shrieked. Following her glance to the front window of their closed carriage, where the back of the driver is usually to be seen, he saw pressed against the glass the distorted face of a demon. The driver was kneeling on his seat instead of sitting on it, and was peering in at them, the reins drawn over his shoulder, and his back to the horses. It seemed to Standish that the light of insanity gleamed from his eyes, but Tina saw in them the revengeful glare of the vendetti, the rage of the disappointed lover. "My God, that's not our driver!" cried Standish, who did not recognize the man who had once endeavored to kill him. He sprang up and tried to open the front window, but the driver yelled out, "Open that window if you dare, and I'll drive you over here before you get halfway down. Sit still, and I take you as far as the Weisse Knut. That's where you are going over. There you'll have a drop of a mile, un miglio." "Turn to your horses, you scoundrel," shouted Standish, "or I'll break every bone in your body." "The horses know their way, Signor Inglese, and all our bones are going to be broken, yours and your sweet bride's, as well as mine." The driver took the whip and fired off a fusillade of cracks overhead, beside them, and under them. The horses dashed madly down the slope, almost sending the carriage over at the next turn. Standish looked at his wife. She had apparently fainted, but in reality had merely closed her eyes to shut out the horrible sight of Pietro's face. Standish thrust his arms out of the open window, unfastened the door, and at the risk of his neck, jumped out. Tina shrieked when she opened her eyes and found herself alone. Pietro now pushed in the frame of the front window, and it dropped out of sight, leaving him face to face with her, with no glass between them. "Now that your fine Inglese is gone, Tina, we are going to be married. You promised it, you know." "You coward," she hissed. "I'd rather die his wife than live yours." "You're plucky, little Tina. You always were. But he left you. I wouldn't have left you. I won't leave you. We'll be married at the chapel of the Three Holy Springs, a mile below the Weissakanot. We'll fly through the air to it, Tina, and our bed will be at the foot of the Madatsi Glacier. We will go over together near where the man threw his wife down. They have marked the spot with a marble slab, but they will put a bigger one for us, Tina, for there's two of us. Tina crouched in the corner of the carriage and watched the face of the Italian as if she were fascinated. She wanted to jump out as her husband had done, but she was afraid to move, feeling certain that if she attempted to escape, Pietro would pounce down upon her. He looked like some wild beast crouching for a spring. All at once, she saw something drop from the sky on the footboard of the carriage. Then she heard her husband's voice ring out, "Here, you young fool, we've had enough of this nonsense." The next moment, Pietro fell to the road, propelled by a vigorous kick. His position lent itself to treatment of that kind. The carriage gave a bump as it passed over Pietro's leg, and then Tina thinks that she fainted in earnest, for the next thing she knew, the carriage was standing still, and Standish was rubbing her hands and calling her pleasant names. She smiled wanly at him. "How in the world did you catch up to the carriage, and it going so fast?" she asked, a woman's curiosity prompting her first words. "Oh, the villain forgot about the shortcuts. As I warned him, he ought to have paid more attention to what was going on outside. I'm going back now to have a talk with him. He's lying on the road at the upper end of this slope." Tina was instantly herself again. "No, dearest," she said caressingly. "You mustn't go back. He probably has a knife." "I'm not afraid." "No, but I am, and you mustn't leave me." "I would like to tie him up in a hard knot and take him down to civilization, bumping behind the carriage as luggage. I think he's the fellow who knifed me, and I want to find out what his game is." Here Tina unfortunately began to faint again. She asked for wine in a far-off voice, and Standish at once forgot all about the demon driver. He mounted the box and took the reins himself. He got wine at the little cabin of the Weissakanot, a mile or two farther down. Tina, who had revived amazingly, probably on account of the motion of the carriage, shuddered as she looked into the awful gulf and saw 5 tiny toy houses in the gloom nearly a mile below. "That," said Standish, "is the chapel of the Three Holy Springs. We will go there tonight if you like, from Trefo." "No, no," cried Tina, shivering. "Let us get out of the mountains at once." At Trefo they found their own driver awaiting them. "What the devil are you doing here, and how did you get here?" hotly inquired Standish. "By the shortcuts," replied the bewildered man. "Pietro, one of Master's old drivers, wanted, I don't know why, to drive you as far as Trefo. Where is he, sir?" "I don't know," said Standish. "We saw nothing of him. He must have been pushed off the box by the madman. Here, jump up and let us get on." Tina breathed again. The crisis was over. They live very happily together, for Tina is a very tactful little woman,